in the auditorium. So
So, welcome. Good morning. It's a great pleasure being here. It's a great pleasure to start the last day of this festival devoted to improvisation that's called Silence Producing Machine. Throughout all these days, we have reflected about the different approximations, the different perspectives from where we can understand the art of improvisation. It is clear for us that it's an art, but I think it's an art in the Greek sense that what combines technique but also virtue. And today in this panel, I have the pleasure that I will be moderating. I will be moderating this panel with people with a very interesting profile and with a wide trajectory. They are going to introduce us into a reflection about how improvisation can be enhanced and can be widened to other territories, if that can be said. We've been talking about this throughout all the colloquium because it ain't just a discipline or just a practice as an art of life. It is an expansion and it's scattering by basically every human activity. So, in this panel that is called collaboration or to collaborate, yeah, it's super wide, but at the same time it gives us an indication of one of the characteristics of improvisation, which is creating processes of collaboration. There are processes that have to do with dialogue, processes that have to do with listening, but today we're going to focus a little more uh, although our panelists that I'm going to present might move to whatever their improvisation forces drive them, so that we can build bridges towards what collaboration means in this sense of working together, collaborate, working together, working as a whole. So, what do we do when we improvise? We look for a collective aim, or the collaboration has to do with being able to put a lot of energies together so that they can actually function as a whole. So this also has to do with social movements, with the social characteristic of improvisation. Improvisation as a political stance in some of these panels that we have had throughout this festival. Improvisation has appeared as a social aspect and as a political movement too. And here is where improvisation also can be taken as an asset. Indeed, as an asset, as a bonus that it's applied to the processes of problem resolution. So we will be talking about all these topics and many more. I want to thank all the people who are here because we are in that moment where of the meetings where it's the last day. It's very early in the morning, at least here in Mexico, after the Friday, you know. So thanks for the people who are here present. We will give you an extra diploma, a bonus for being here present this morning. We will try to make it count and to make it worth it. So I want to say hi also to the people who are online in this transmission, this live transmission, and of course to our speakers, well, our presenters that we're now seeing on screen. And I will give floor to them so that they can participate. First of all, as you may know, we have Cees Hamelink, George Lipsitz, Rebecca Kane. Well, she had a situation, and very kindly she sent us a video with her intervention. Also, we have Ricardo Arias here present in the facilities in Mexico, but all of you are most welcome. We're happy to have you here. So, hello to the people online, to George and Sis. And we are super happy to have you here. I will give the floor to Cees Hamelink by saying very briefly that he's an emerita professor in the University of Amsterdam and professor of human rights and public health in the University of Amsterdam. He is also director. He's an author. He has published books on human rights and public health, and he is an accordionist in a group of jazz, which speaks that of the profiles, which is a very characteristic feature of the people. Uh, for us, it's something super nice. It's different capabilities at work. So I give the floor to Cees Hamelink. Welcome.
Thank you very much. As a jazz musician, when you're improvising, you have to make choices all the time, permanently. And I think many of these choices are very important, but there's one choice that I think is absolutely the most crucial. When you're playing, you have to think about whether you create something in time, which means you try to reflect the time in which you live. Or you create music, or you create an object out of time out of time. I think those choice comes for me from the paintings of an Italian painter called Giorgio Morandi. Giorgio Morandi painted all his life stills over the past century. He died in 1964. He painted, contrary to most nature more stills painters, non-perishable objects. Usually, stills are just an apple or a flower or a pheasant or whatever, things that go by as time goes by. He chose objects that not so easily perish. He chose pots and bottles, containers, and he painted them all his life. And he kept painting them in spite of the fact that the world around him, was in a Second World War, was in a war in Vietnam, was an Algerian war. And in spite of all that war and violence, he just continued painting his objects. And by doing that, he created parallel time. And that is something that the jazz improviser can do. We can create parallel time. And I believe that when we do so, we open the door to what I would consider to be the most precious and the most meaningful gift of humanity. That's the capacity for cooperative conversation. Now that's a remarkable capacity, and we can be very good at that, but the remarkable thing is that we very rarely use it. This enormous gift to converse with each other, and converse with each other in a collaborative, in a cooperative way. We seem to be making only a very economic use, because throughout my long life in different institutions, I've seen very little cooperative conversation within the United Nations that I had the pleasure of working with for so many years, or within the different universities where I was employed. And most recently, it's quite clear that in my city, Amsterdam, the two leading universities have shown that their boards are totally incapable of cooperative conversation in dealing with the student protests. They seem to be unable to talk with the students. And yet, that is remarkable because our brains are perfectly wired for cooperative communication. And that is because we understand as a species so well how cooperation is absolutely essential to our survival. We learned that early on in our evolutionary process, that we can only protect ourselves against predators, against the changes in nature. We can only survive in increasingly complex societies if we communicate in a collaborative manner. We can only protect ourselves against nature. Often it's being said nature needs to be protected against us, but I think it is precisely the other way around. Mother Gaia is royally pissed off with the way in which we've treated her planet. And we need to protect it from her anger. And in order to do that, well, we need to talk with each other. We need to try to understand each other. And we can do that not only because of our cooperative instinct, but also because of something that is probably unique for the human species, which is shared intentionality. We share goals, we share plans, we share beliefs, assumptions, and motives. We can ask one another for clarification, and it is very unlikely that any other animal will do that. Shared intentionality means that we can seek common conceptual ground. And as we do that, we seem to be able to communicate complex feelings, emotions, with very simple gestures. Just think about the deep emotions we can transmit by just the wink of an eye. And actually, now that I talk about it, I seem to be able thinking that we should probably have expanded that repertoire of gestures, which would have been very nice also for people with hearing difficulties. But rather than expanding our repertoire of gestures, we expanded focal language. And that's one of the obstacles to really communicating with each other. It's beautiful that we have language, but we've chosen a very complicated one that is dependent upon symbols, symbols that can only be understood by codes that we share. Because we use symbols that do not refer to the objects that they are supposed to represent. You can say table, but the word table has no meaning unless you know what the table is. You need to know the secret code. That's why most human communication fails. And again, in a long life, particularly in international negotiations, I've seen that that happens time and time again. We just don't understand each other. And that may be also true with this colloquium. You may not understand a word of what I'm saying, or we may understand halfway each other. But I have a feeling that at this colloquium, we understand each other quite well because we have a shared intentionality. We share the intention to try to understand what improvisation is and how that relates to the notion of cooperation. Now, in order to do that, I think we need to depart from the notion that all human conversations are improvisations. In a way, they are collective improvisations. And what is fascinating about the collective improvisation, that only works if you listen. And that sounds very simple, but that is in actual fact quite complicated, because listening is the forbidding art. We are very bad at listening. We are good talkers. In our history, we have demonstrated that we have very big mouths and very small ears. We don't listen well. If in international politics we would listen better to each other, I think the world would be a different place. But we find that difficult. And also in science doesn't really listen. In the whole history of philosophy, you find definitions, you find determinations, you find diagnoses, you find very little listening. We desperately need an epistemology of listening. We need to learn to listen, which is quite complicated because we live in modern societies where if listening means attention to another, that is quite an obstacle because we live in what I call selfie society. We're more interested in ourselves. We also like to take pictures of ourselves, not asking someone else to do that because you may have to engage in a conversation with someone. Our interest for others is a rather minimal scale. Now then, also related to the topic of this colloquium, listening needs silence. Where do you find silence in a society when you go into a concert, they sell you earplugs? Silence is a very scarce commodity. Go into any restaurant in Mexico City and you find blaring at you big television screens with so much noise that you don't have to converse with your partner. And for some, that may be a blessing in disguise. Then, what listening also needs is patience. But we don't have patience. We live in a hurry. We live in a fast society. We check our mobile phones 150 times a day because we want to be in the loop. And of course, we need to cooperate, but how do you cooperate in an excessively competitive society where everything is made into a battle? Even music, and I think that's one of the most ludicrous things that I know about, that make music contests to decide who is the best tenor player or who is the best piano player. Absolute rubbish. We should not do that in the musical world. We should improvise, but we should improvise together. And that's difficult because then we have to listen. And as I just mentioned, there are great obstacles to the art of listening. Now, the great New Orleans maestros of the early 20th century were people who knew how to collectively improvise because they had good ears, as jazz musicians say. They could listen. They were hearing what the others were playing. And I would hope that we can reinstall that pleasure of collective improvisation. Because I know that certainly in the jazz scene in Europe, and certainly in my hometown, Ámsterdam, where we have one of the best conservatories for the jazz education. And there's large numbers of incredibly talented young people who study there and who play all in marvelous ways. But they all play as if they want to reflect our modern societies. They all want to be virtuoso. They play fast. They play complex. they play as individualists. And very rarely do I see, even in big bands, and we have some marvelous youth big bands in Europe, the young kids really listening to each other. They all seem to be interested in their own solos. And they play, as I would say, in time. They've given in to the temptations of chronos. They play in measured time. And they lose the opportunity to seek for kairos, for music in time, out of time. And just like the painter, Giorgio, I mentioned in the beginning, we should try to look for that parallel time. And jazz musicians can do that. We can improvise in parallel time. And why is that so important? Because, again, that may lead the way into understanding how important this cooperative conversation among us is. Jazz music does not have to reflect the lunacy of our time. That's what the lunatics can do themselves. They can take care of it. Jazz music should create time without time, parallel time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Great thoughts and reflections you share with us. Muchísimas gracias, Cees. Grandes reflexiones y pensamientos nos has.
Thank you, Cees, for your reflections. And we're going to sort of write this down, or to put a pin on it, to create a link with the following participation. And I ask the audience to keep intertwining all the, not only the words, but the ideas that are present here, so that ideas can start to create a river of understanding here in this space. Cees is talking about the parallel time, the creation of a parallel time, and a series of necessities that have to do with what we are thinking here in this space, the shared intentions, and of course, being able to communicate among ourselves, to express the complexity of what we are living, of what we want to say, with simple gestures, which is one of the big challenges that we have ahead. So thanks, Cees. We keep all these understandings, and we will now give the floor to our next participant, who is George Lipsitz. I will introduce George a little bit so that you can get to know him a little better. Let me check my archive in my cell phone. Just give me a second. Okay, here it is. George Lipsitz is a professor and researcher, emerit researcher of studies Blackness and history in the University of Santa Barbara. He has received a number of awards, also participated in investigation projects focused on collaborative communities and equitable communities. He has created transactions and links with different associations. And undoubtedly, George, and I'm really happy to say hi, with a lot of hospitality from Mexico City, so that you can share with us your thoughts, so that we can incorporate them to the current thinking. So I give you the floor, George.
Well, thank you. Good morning, everybody. Buenos dias a todos. It's a pleasure to be here with old friends and new friends. In his wonderfully eloquent and insightful presentation, Cees Hamelink asked us to think about parallel time. And he talked about the New Orleans ensemble Dixieland musicians of the early 20th century, the Buddy Boldens and Louis Armstrongs and Lil Hardin, as creating both something new and improvisatory, but also something that was deliberately out of time with the dominant values and aspirations of the society in which they live. And I'm going to try to pick up on that in New Orleans with one of the successors of those groups and a creator of parallel time. So the time on the calendar is 1950. 10-year-old Jerome Smith, a young Black boy, gets on a streetcar in New Orleans. For 75 years, the streetcars have been segregated. Blacks sit in the back, whites sit in the front. There's a sign that says, that divides the races. Jerome is 10 years old. He gets on the bus and he decides to improvise. He decides to live in parallel time. So he tears down the sign that requires segregation, and he sits right up front where the white people are supposed to sit. And he doesn't sit in the back where Black people are consigned. And the bus goes crazy. The streetcar goes crazy. The conductor stops the car and yells at him. The white people shake their fists at him and tell him to move to the back. And it looks like he's going to be beaten up because at 10 years old, he's creating a time that's outside the time of 75 years of racist segregation. A Black woman in the back of the car does her own improvisation. She stands up and points her finger at Jerome and scolds him. And she says, "You should never disrespect white people. I'm going to take you off this car and teach you a lesson." And she pulls him by the arm, takes him off the car, and he thinks she's going to slap him for being insolent and impudent and opposing white supremacy. She takes him behind a building and hugs him and kisses him and says, "I'm so proud of you. Never, ever stop. Don't you ever quit. You're doing the right thing." So there are two improvisations here. There's Jerome at 10 years old tearing down the sign. There's a woman in her 50s who performs one thing in white people's time, looking like she's going to discipline her own group, and another thing in her time behind the auto parts store where she tells him, "Keep fighting, don't stop." Now, when people talk about improvisation, they often think only in terms of expressive culture, and they often think only in terms of things that are unplanned, that are spontaneous. What Jerome Smith and that woman did on the streetcar was unplanned. It was spontaneous, but it had a long history of preparation behind it. That Jerome Smith, even at 10 years old, knew what to do because he grew up in a household where his family talked glowingly about Paul Robeson and Mary McLeod Bethune, where his grandfather was a member of the Black Longshoremen's Union, where every so often on festive occasions, he'd see his community marching in the streets in parades, playing music, instruments up front, second line dancers behind, wearing fancy costumes and marching in ways that affirm their creativity, their uniqueness, their bravery, inventing their own songs, symbols, and language. And so at 10 years old, Jerome knew what to do. 11 years later, Jerome is 21. It's 1961. And he goes to Mississippi to be part of the Black freedom struggle. And he finds communities that are suppressed and segregated, shunned and silenced, but they're active, they're energetic, they're engaged. And they're engaged because they know how to improvise. They know how to live in parallel time. The key organizer of the Mississippi Freedom Movement was Bob Moses, a math teacher from New York who came down to Mississippi to help organize against white supremacy. And the way Bob Moses would go into a town to organize wasn't to call a meeting. It wasn't to pass out a leaflet. He didn't write a manifesto. He didn't go see the mayor. He didn't talk to somebody in the press. He stood on a corner and bounced the rubber ball. And he found if you stand on a corner long enough and bounce the rubber ball, somebody will put their hands up and say, "Hey, throw it here." And then they'll throw it back to you. And then you start talking and you say, "What's going on in this city? What's it like to be here?" And through that improvised conversation, Bob Moses would start to become part of the communities as somebody who was living with them, not somebody who was leading them. Moses attracted a group of theater students from Jackson State University who thought they should put on plays to dramatize the freedom struggle for sharecroppers, for day laborers, for maids and butlers, for people who did hard work in the fields. But it was too dangerous to call a meeting. It was illegal to pass out leaflets against white supremacy. You could be lynched and brutalized for doing that, but you could get a space in a barn. You could get a space in a church. You could have people come to a clearing and they wrote plays together. They improvised. They created a play that hadn't been in existence before. And they did it through the story circle. They'd sit in a circle and they'd say, what happened today? And one person would say, well, I had to take the back road to town because I owed the boss some money and I didn't want him to see me. And then somebody else would build on that. And they'd collectively write a play, and then they'd perform it for the whole community and have a talk back afterwards. This was the start of the Free Southern Theater in the 1960s. And this pedagogy, this story circle way of writing plays, was brought back to New Orleans by Jerome Smith to be part of Students at the Center, an organization he started called Tambourine and Fan, an organization called the Freedom Foundations, where people, young people especially, talk stories, create plays, write books together, make films, and do things collectively in which they're living in segregated time, but imagining and creating a different kind of time. Now, these kinds of improvisations didn't come out of the blue, and they continue throughout the Black freedom movement. They start long before Jerome Smith got on that bus. I want to finish by talking about one more improvisation. December 2nd, 1859, Harpers Ferry, Virginia, a white abolitionist named John Brown is hanged for treason because he raided a federal arsenal to get guns to give to slaves to rise up in rebellion against the cruelty and brutality of the slave system. Brown was executed as a traitor. The arsenal was retaken and he was captured by a military unit headed by an Army colonel named Robert E. Lee. And Brown was defamed, ridiculed nationally. It was one of the first historical events spread by telegraph. And nearly everybody said Brown was crazy, that Brown was a criminal, because Brown said that slavery was a vile, vicious, violent system that would only be ended through violence. That was considered crazy. 1859. Nobody described it as a raid. Nobody described it as a freedom effort. It was described as an insurrection, a rebellion, and treason. And nearly everybody supported the execution of John Brown. The politicians were for it, the press was for it, the preachers were for it, the public was for it, but the enslaved saw it differently. Word about John Brown's raid spread throughout slave communities. And you have to ask how that could be, because the slaves were kept illiterate. They were not allowed to travel. They were in chains. They were beaten with whips. They were in groups. Most of the slaves were in a group of 10 or fewer people who were enslaved. But they somehow knew about John Brown. January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln issues the Emancipation Proclamation, and 200,000 Black people leave slavery to go join the Union Army. And thousands of others go support the Army. They do logistics for it. They bring them food. They move along with them. Another 1 million enslaved people stage a general strike in the fields that kills the economy of the Confederacy. And it's at this moment that the US Civil War becomes a war against slavery. And that means white workers who had dodged the draft, who had not wanted to be part of it, now had a reason to fight. And you have white people divided. Some white workers in the North join the Union Army, and they sing about John Brown as if he was Jesus Christ. They see him as a martyr. They see him as somebody creating American freedom. They talk about Jesus as dying to make men holy, and John Brown dying to make men free. So these penniless, illiterate, dispersed, chained and shackled people coordinated a rebellion. And they did it because of a culture of opposition and improvisation, because they met at midnight in clearings and danced the ring shout. They created music together. They turned the Christian Bible, which was a Bible of coping, into a promise of freedom that was an enabling freedom. In the slave cabins, they put up pictures of John Brown, and they created hospitality for people who were running away, even though there was great personal risk. So when Jerome Smith, at 10 years old, engages in an act of improvisation, he's dealing with a long history in his family of creating parallel time, a long history in his city of creating parallel time, but also the deep and profound wisdom of Black people, an intelligent, collective intelligence honed in struggle that says when the time is right, you have to be prepared to know what you want to do. Stokely Carmichael, later known as Kwame Ture, used to say, if you can get ready, you don't have to be ready. He took that slogan from Sekou Touré in the nation of Guinea, who talked about being prêt pour la révolution, ready for the revolution. So the whole point of improvisation is to imagine and enact parallel time, to be ready so you don't have to get ready, and to be able to act not only on a streetcar in New Orleans or in a slave community in the 1860s throughout the South, but in Ferguson, Missouri on August 9th, 2014, when Lewis Head, the stepfather of Michael Brown, takes a marker on a piece of cardboard and he says, Ferguson police have just murdered my unarmed son. And that sign becomes a picture on Black Twitter. And as it spreads on Twitter, people flock to the scene and they put flowers and teddy bears on the spot where Michael Brown was killed. And they helped launch the Black Lives Matter movement, which has had an enormous impact to this day. So improvisation is not just an artistic device. It's not just a form of expressive culture, although it can be learned and honed and refined in expressive culture. It's also part of the survival strategy of oppressed people, what James C. Scott calls one of the weapons of the weak. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, George, por estas emotivas.
Thanks a lot, George, for these words, stories, and that you are bringing to us that are it's actually very present. Many of what you are saying, the struggle is real, the struggle is occurring in the present time, is still occurring, and the way you are expressing this is obviously connected with what Cees mentioned about the parallel time, a parallel time that can be created through improvisation, but also I think that you are somehow urging us to think about the strategies that can allow us to conduct a resistance, to conduct or to face the struggle, being ready so that you don't have to be ready. You know, that's super relevant. That's kind of the quality that we've been looking forward in this meeting, that whatever occurs or that emerges as an improvisation, it's actually a result of a previous configuration of a wide previous movement. And what it's doing is at that particular moment, it emerges as a plant, as a flower, and that emergence can give other results. But both you and Cees, you are giving us somehow something like a path where we can modify the script, so to speak, as Cees was saying. You can play music and you can play music in certain tempo, but you can do it in a different timing. You can follow the stories told by George about Jerome. You can follow that continuum. You can adhere to the patterns, although that means oppression, or you can improvise something new. You can improvise a different timing. And well, thank you, George. Thanks for your participation. I will now give floor to the presentation of Rebecca Keynes. As I said before, Rebecca was not able to make it to the Zoom connection, but she shared a video with us. Rebecca is an artist, an interdisciplinary artist, also a researcher. Her practice, artistical practice, as a professor, as a scholar, as a researcher, she is in this realm of creativity, sound art, the new media, and of course, improvisation and the contemporary performance linked to art in a specific location and relational art or that is rooted in the communities. So I will share the presentation of Rebecca Keynes, and then we will continue with Ricardo Arias. And I hope we can have some minutes to talk to you so that we can have a conversation with the attendees so that we can flow together. So I will now share the video of Rebecca Keynes.
Hello, Mexico City. I'm so sad that I can't be with you in person. I'm in Australia right now where it's 1:30 in the morning. But I know, and I'm recording this early, but I know the festival is amazing. I can see it coming. And I'm so happy to be able to share with you this paper called How I Learned to Improvise, 7 Things Taught to Me by Communities at Risk. Thank you so much for inviting me. So I thought I knew how to improvise. I mean, I played a lot as a kid and I lived outside in a beautiful property. I even learned clowning from a retired clown who lived in our neighborhood when I was little. And then I learned about structured improvisation, about forum theater, about short form theater when I was in university. And then eventually about free improvised music and its incredible history. But really, I didn't learn how to improvise until I started working with communities, my communities and those who invited me in. So I just thought I'd share 7 things that I learned from communities. And these are communities that are at risk of neglect, risk of injustice, risk of constant attempts at erasure, and yet thriving through improvisation. So the first thing I learned is what I call to be fragile or to go fragile. I have learned with community that I just don't know. To improvise has been about to let go of the need to know, to be the expert, to be in control, to come deliberately naive, out of step. As Petra Kappas says, shouldn't we expect to stumble on uncertain and unknowable ground? And so this to me is about going fragile. This is not to be confused with what D'Angelo famously called white fragility, which is when people with racial privilege become distressed and defensive when they're made to actually consider that privilege. Instead, it's a call to let go, to allow ourselves to be only ever partially aware, to be truly vulnerable with each other. As Vasquez Martin suggests, improvising means exposing yourself to unwanted situations that could break the foundations of your own security. Once you are out, there is no way back, he says. You cannot regret what you've done. You must engage in questioning your security. See it as a constriction. Keep going forward and to what you do not know, to what is questioning your knowledge and your use of it. And he calls this to go fragile. So improvising this way is to push back against individualist models altogether, to search for locally co-created interdependent structures to support us that can honestly engage with difference, with unevenness, with partiality, and expose where those rigid, systemized structures of inequality persist. I think of the work of Australian phenomenologist and philosopher Linnell Seacombe, who reminds us that some kinds of community structure are not equitable. She says that they can, in fact, be haunted by the injustices that form them. They can be fractured communities that must be and need to be resisted. And this is where I think taking improvisation seriously as both a method and an outcome can be useful. improvising together, as theatre scholars such as Rustin Barucha outline, exposes the power differences in the room. It leaves the improvisers the difficult task of negotiating, communicating, co-creating, maybe taking up the urgent task of finding an ending and then starting a new beginning. So from communities, I have learned this a kind of going fragile can be about trusting the unexpected. When I worked with youth in regional Australia and someone's grandma, who I didn't know, said she would make the costume for the performance, but she doesn't drive, so could I send the material and the pattern on the school bus out to the valley, and then she will make it and she will send it back on the school bus. And then it means waiting at the bus stop for a few days to see if the costume appears. And when it does, a little bit dusty from the bus, it's resplendent. Maybe you have to trust that things won't go wrong when a bunch of teenagers playing improv games in a housing estate in still very segregated Northern Ireland realize that they're teachers from the other side of the conflict. And I jump with shock when a guy leaps on the table and yells, "I've never met a Catholic before." And then we all stop, we're all silent, this could go either way. And then suddenly we're shaking hands, we're laughing, because of course it's okay, because we've been improvising all these weeks together and that made it okay. Going fragile, creating fragile momentary structures together. This is what communities taught me. But they've also taught me that there is such a thing as mistake. I think there can be a bit of a shallow response when thinking about improvisation, to think that there is no such thing as mistake. And I mean, I guess that comes from a good place, right? We can't be concerned about worrying about making mistakes. Improvising couldn't possibly happen there. And all the best moments come from things that come from moments you were surprised by. But that doesn't mean there's no mistakes. Being an asshole is a mistake. Being a racist, homophobic, selfish, greedy asshole is a mistake. So if there are mistakes, then how do we reconcile this with our desire for improvisation to be about a lack of fear and a flow? Well, I think it all depends on what happens with the mistake. Because they happen, mistakes are human. They share experiences, and this is kind of part of the deal. But do we let the mistake have a life, or do we shove it under a carpet? Do we cover it up? Do we try to pretend it didn't happen? I've written before and spoken in Guelph actually about a project I did in Northern Ontario where I went for a grant to do a project before I knew the community because I thought I knew them when I didn't. And that was a major mistake. That was a mistake that took years to think through and to live with. Constantly talking to people, trying to find a way that maybe we could get to know each other, maybe we could work together. And that mistake continued to bring fruit, but it was still a mistake. It was still overreach. It was still a white lady from Australia thinking she knew something she didn't know. Some pictures from that project, when we found a way to connect to the teams that were recording on the land and learn how to use audio recorders. When people started discovering the joy of recording sounds, everyday sounds. When people took mics out into the community and started recording the sounds of the community. This is Philip. He made a rap about his community using sounds he recorded. And this is my favorite moment where some teenagers connected with an elder for the first time through a translator in talking about sound and in laughing together and playing together. That was a really special moment. So from my family, who've always had like extra people in our lives, always extra people in our house, but also from all the communities I've lived and worked in, I've learned that if you want to improvise, you have to visit. I know visiting has a particular resonance in Indigenous communities. People talk a lot about visiting. Indigenous researcher Sherry Farrell particularly talks about kitchen table methodologies, where you come together and you sit and you share at the kitchen table as a way of learning and making and being together. For me, visiting has included making endless cups of tea, never strong enough for certain Irish grandmothers who sometimes would take the pot off me. It has involved making and eating food together. It's involved walking on the rounds with health workers as they visit their clients and learning what it's like inside the health systems that we're working with. In 2016, my colleague, Michelle Stewart, and I wanted to make an improv kit for frontline workers, for those organizations who were trying to help people with fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, which is a disability that's really misunderstood, they're stigmatized. There's a lot of work to be done. And we thought that improvised music or theater might be able to help. So I'll play the video about how we sort of got to this project. And then I'll talk about the visiting that we did with it.
This project started from my own research. I work on fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And I was trying to figure out a way that we could do a strength-based approach to research on FASD. And so I reached out to my colleague, Rebecca Keynes, and asked her if there was a way we could stay in the moment together using a method that she knew, which was improvisation.
The skills of improvisation include trust, risk, listening, active listening, not just waiting for your turn, but really actively listening. It also includes being able to take what some people might think is a mistake and turn it into some creative, productive moment.
Improvisation is a really easy, accessible way to access group dynamic and skill building in a group. It really offers a bunch of different ways to access really simple skills like spontaneity and the passing around of group leadership.
One of the things that one of the workers told us was that they saw this as an opportunity to use improv as a mechanism to explore life skills. And so for some of our frontline workers and our support workers, they regularly host sessions that focus on very critical life skills. And then at the same time, we're able to explore impulse and the ways in which people work together, listen together, read body language together in the workshops. And so I see a series of really interesting ways to explore people's strengths together and watching people learn together as a way to, once again, explore and support one another in the communities we all live in.
When we started, we knew we'd be playing some theatre games, maybe making some music together. But as the project grew, we incorporated different artists and different art forms. So people would come together, they would try out a selection of games and exercises, but they would also bring their own creative ideas, their own songs, their own music, their own drawing as well, and that would be incorporated in. We also had a quiet space where people could colour and draw, and actually that quiet space soon sort of got integrated into the workshops.
Some of the participants started to say that they were tired, and initially I thought that might not be good if they're tired. But what we found out in the process later is that people were looking to be tired. They told us that they would have welcomed to be tired more regularly. And I think the combination of a lot of brain work and movement together makes people a little bit tired in a good way at the end of the workshops. And so we developed a series of sleep and relaxation tools with individuals where they're using a cluster of technologies that are therapeutic and relaxing in some ways, and then blending that with some improvisation games.
Myself and my collaborator, Johanna Bunden, were invited to sort of offer a workshop series through our relationship with some researchers at the University of Regina to offer improvisation workshops. And so we reached out to a group that we'd worked with many times before that were adults that had acquired brain injuries, as well as who deal with a number of other disorders or social isolation issues. Some of the feedback we've received is mostly around just how much fun it was and how different it was. I've definitely heard feedback from staff that when the group members are inside the workshop, it's some of the most outgoing behavior they've seen from those individuals.
The pilots have grown and we are now taking improvisation workshops to new partners and seeing what we can find in the community that might fit. So we'll be visiting in the north of Canada, we'll be going to Northern Ireland and to Australia.
We saw that there was a lot of potential here. We started to reach out to partners across Canada and actually around the world, and there's a lot of interest in figuring out exactly what improv can do and help us learn about FASD as we're supporting people in our communities. And so we've developed this great little toolkit. This is going to be available for September 9th, free for those that are interested. As everyone knows, September 9th is International FASD Awareness Day. And so one of the things we're going to do is try to get people to do improv on September 9th as one of the outreach tools we're doing, which is making this whole toolkit available and free at no charge to families and community organizations and individuals that want to explore FASD, explore social isolation, or just figure out ways to have some fun together.
I think it's hard to say how improvisation will affect any one person or any one group, but I think there's a lot of potential for improvisation to have a positive impact on people as individuals, but also sort of a social group dynamic.
An early draft of the kit that you saw there. And we then took the kit on the road. And we visited. I've never visited so much in my life. We visited and asked people what they needed. We did workshops in doctors' surgeries, in jails, in friendship centers, in parks. We changed the kit based on what we heard, and it's now being used across the globe. It's free to download. It's a series of improvisation games and some of the things you can use them for. And I love hearing how people are using it. It's I feel like I'm visiting with them. When they download the kit, we ask them to explain what they're going to use it for. And some of the quotes that I've heard in those emails when people download the kit are really important part of the work. One group in Japan said, "I want us to get to know each other differently." Another group in Alberta said, "We want the creativity we know is here to find a path." And another group in Australia said, "I want us to be together instead of alone." So French artist Christian Boltanski famously said he will never make a bronze memorial, a memorial out of bronze, for victims of the Holocaust. He was being asked to make a memorial. He said, "I will never make one out of bronze. The only one I will ever make is out of paper." He said all memorials should be made out of paper, because then if you really want to remember that thing, you have to care for it, you have to protect it. And it's an active act of remembering. And this is a lesson I've learned repeatedly from the communities that I have seen as they navigate how to communally remember, whether it's watching Chinese group in Wuhan try to hold on to the city that's being rapidly developed under them by creating artworks that will help you remember the heritage of the city, but doing so in a transient way when people can get together, and also under the trying to navigate the care to engage with the Communist Party's fears about people getting together. So temporary, momentary projects as possible, where possible, to help hold on to a city. Or this example I always hold on to when I think about remembering, this is a memorial that when refugee boats were on their way to Australia and they sunk in the water and our country did not send anyone to save people, outraged communities made a memorial, particularly to one boat, the Cibex, that sunk in the night. And this memorial was meant to go into the parkland in Canberra, but the government refused to let it be planted. These are the poles. Each pole was made by a different community group across Australia, driven, posted, carried to Canberra, our capital. So on the day that it was meant to open, when the government had revoked the permission, 2,000 people turned up and they held the poles up in the shape of the memorial. They did it anyway. And I think in some ways, this improvised memorial is more powerful than the actual finally 2 years later when it was allowed to go into the ground. And I learned a lot about paper memorials when I worked with patients who were living in a rehabilitation hospital in Regina in Saskatchewan. We played music together every week. But these were folks who couldn't go home to be looked after because they had no family. And they were trying to find ways to remember when many of them were on medications, when people were passing away, where lots of folks were nonverbal. So these are people with severe medical issues. And so every week we had to basically start again. Every week was new. What we held on to was in our bodies, perhaps, and in our music. And so I'll just play a little bit of music that we made together. This was a piece where we specifically improvised around the idea of remembering the people that weren't there anymore. Fifth thing that I have learned to celebrate is to fidget. So, fidgeting, it's the movement that you make when you want to calm down, you want to process information. People use these fidgeting devices to help regulate, but it's also for joy, for protest, for creativity. So the word fidget means to move repeatedly, sometimes unconsciously, to adjust, to shift, to stimulate. And in 2019 to 2021, in a project called Sonic Blankets, that was part of a bigger project called Multiplay, I had the chance to realize with young disabled artists and grad students, the fidgets actually had a great creative and political power. And I suddenly saw my sound-making instruments and objects that I play music with as a kind of fidget. I learned that playing and stimming and moving while we're thinking can all coexist. And with musician James Harley and researcher Michelle Stewart and graduates from the IC program, we fidgeted new music and new creations together. We learn about each other's sensory differences. We learn how different people hear and respond. And we learn about the joy of that difference. This was an amazing moment where the musicians and a youth artist had shared their fidgeting devices together, and we were playing with the sonic potential of them. So this is a clip of youth artists, Keisha and Tanzan, discovering the sonic potential of everyday objects through fidgeting. Went on for a very long time as they discovered and played, and as James Harley spatialized, and we made this music together from fidgets. So just last year, well, earlier this year actually, I continued this work in a workshop called Fidgeting for Creativity, Comfort and Care, a play shop. And this is with disabled artists Pam Patterson and Patricia Lamy. And it was for the launch of a new lab at OCAD University in Toronto called Grip Lab, where we invited people with disabilities to come and be with us and create together. And we explored the idea of fidget more together. So this is a kind of shot of me in the workshop. And I just wanted to play a little bit of us sharing our kind of research on fidgets together. This is after we'd had the day exploring, and we invited everyone who attended the opening to join us. And just a little bit of what we did together.
Good. I have a very quick little score we can try if you're interested. It's called 3, Sound, and Silence. So that's what you have in your repertoire. You're allowed to make sound 3 times, and then you also have to work with silence. That's the only rules. But the other thing is we're making this piece of music together, so we have to listen to each other. Oh, yeah. So you have to find a spot to put your 3 sounds and your silence. Right? Does that make sense? So we're all 3 times making some sound, and that's all. And 3 times we're going to try and, think about silence as a thing we can also use. Are we ready?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it.
1, 2, 3.
You want us to start? We find a beginning together. There it is. Thing that I have learned is that a lot of my work is site specific and engages with ideas of place. But there's an Indigenous phrase in Canada, all my relations, and it means engaging with not just the humans in a place, but the animals, the plants, and that we're all related and interdependent. So I've been with improvising artist and researcher Dustin Brass, developing new ways of teaching land-based improvising at the York University in Canada. We had our first class just this spring. He'll be coming back next year again. And he shared land-based learning along with other Indigenous partners across the university campus, and the students explored and related to land through their own lenses. You can see us doing different exercises here. These are some of the works that came from that class. This is Sarah Mazafari Laristani. She's an Iranian artist, improvising under her 3D printed chador that she made. It's an unbelievably beautiful piece of fabric put together with geometric shapes. A chador is a word that can relate to the burkas, but also to the tents of her nomadic relations. So she improvised under this piece of material that she created in order to honor the plants, as well as her journey from Iran to Canada. And this is Shannon Garden Smith. Her work explores sand and its history and place in our world. And she took water from the creek that was diverted to make the York University campus and used that water to weave by placing her hands on the sand in a durational performance on the campus. So just really interesting responses to thinking about improvising with all our relations. And the last thing I want to talk about is the idea of finding a listening path. So for the last 2 years, I've been at this new university, and we've been building this new campus and this new program that's going to open just in September. So my work has been focused on trying to find a way this new university program can be different to other university programs that have failed so many communities. And I hope that we could work out whose land we were on, connect back to this land, and build partnerships to support things that communities were doing in the area. So the first thing we did is build an Indigenous advisory circle, asking elders and local artists what they were working on and how they might want to work with us. This was our first event that actually Ellen Waterman collaborated with me on. This is us round dancing together. So these are folks that came together to help us form an Indigenous advisory circle. And we're round dancing an improvised form of dance through a computer lab. And we apparently, I was very happy to learn, left the lab and the machine smelling like the smudge smoke that was used to clean the air as we started in prayer. And we left them smelling like this smoke, the computers. And we also left them smelling like the bannock, the fried bread that we ate together. That made me very happy. So with this Indigenous Advisory Circle, we have been stumbling together forward and backwards, trying to find out what we could make together. And one of the things I was trying to work out is, what should we call this thing? What name shall we use for this bunch of people trying to build this connection to this place and this program? So the first name that came up, or the first image that came up, was the idea of a trail of footprints made by moccasin shoes, which are the traditional shoes of folks that lived in Canada. And these moccasins, there was this project that a local community was doing, trying to teach people about the land by teaching them about the shoes that people wore, and then making stencils of those shoes and leaving them on the ground so that you could see whose land it was by what shoes people wore there, and all the information you can find out about the temperature and the weather and the activities by the shoes that people wore. So this is an amazing education initiative that's been running for very many years, called the Moccasin Identifier Project. And so what we wanted to do is place some moccasins on our new campus, and then think about what the students could do to animate those moccasins, to add augmented reality layers of maybe music, maybe stories to that trail of moccasins. And that project is funded and will be happening next year. So that first image was an idea of kind of a trail or a path. And so I asked one of the elders that we were working with about the name for that. What would be the name of a trail? And in Plains Cree, it would be Pimachahawowan, which is a word that means travel. It also means journey. It also means living a particular way of life. It also means earning a living, and it also means culture. So for a while there, we thought about calling the project Pimachahawowan. But then the second word to emerge was this word Biskabiyang. And this is an Anishinaabemowin word, and it means to return home from a long journey. So I'm going to quote one of our researchers, Maya Shakaby here, who defines Biskabian for us. She says, "It's this idea of returning home. I love it because it talks about how, as we travel, as we make this long journey to get home, things have changed. People talk about Biskabiyang as a way to talk about resurgence or decolonization. These are all connections to this word," end quote. So Biskabiyang is the name that Maya Shakaby has chosen for her project, and we just got funding together to help build this project. She's working with the Nakiawan Tribal Council to build a video game environment where you can learn Indigenous Anishinaabemowin language by interacting with objects and cultures and quests. But it's not just a game. She wants to create an entire environment where you can come into this virtual online environment and make culture together, play music together, get counseling, learn, teach workshops, an online environment that is created where people can access it from wherever they are. So Biskabiyang, another word for a journey, although a different one. The third word that we were gifted was from a young Inuit improvising artist who I know, who, when she heard about the project, said, "It sounds like Imeriac." And Imeriac is an Anik word for when you're about 2 days away from home and you can almost see the place that you're going, but you can't quite. When you can almost smell and taste and feel home, but you're not quite there. So when I spoke to that knowledge keeper and said, how are we going to name this project? We are not, traditionally, to get a name would be to speak to an elder. In Anishinaabe culture, it would be to speak to an elder, bring tobacco, ask them to dream a name for you. But we are a mix of people from very different communities, not just Anishinaabe or Plains Cree or white settler, and our students are going to be from all over the world. So how do we find a name together. And he suggested maybe it's a project with many names. And so then I started realizing how many different words for journey were emerging through this project, how many different words that meant different things, but somehow connected things were emerging through this project. And the best I could do in English was listening paths. That seemed to be what we were on, a listening path. So I guess the last thing that I'm talking about, having learned from my community about improvising and building together, is the idea that you can have multiple names or multiple journeys that you're on and that they're meeting for a moment, but that does not make them not different journeys. And I found that a very inspiring idea.
Bien, pues agradecemos muchísimo la.
Thanks a lot for this video, a very generous concoction at the time of Rebecca. It was actually quite not just interesting, but inspiring. The work that Rebecca conducts with communities, I think it's amazing because it also shows us the exercising of improvisation, what revolves around the idea of co-creation and creating in environments as a sort of curatorship, but also a way of healing to create more relations. Before giving the floor to Ricardo and moving towards the closure of this panel, I just wanted to share or to connect some ideas that we previously heard, like some ideas of George that are in connection with some of the things that Rebecca mentioned, not just the importance of listening, being able to actively listen, but also the trust, the reliability that is created in the exercise of that listening. And from the idea that Rebecca first stated is to step into fragility, to that can open us to improvisation. We tend to want to be in control. We want to control uncertainty because uncertainty is imposing. Sometimes we tend to move towards annulating or not accepting fragility, because fragility is like, no, we need power, and sometimes we need to go the other way around, to let go in order to be open to improvise, to create a time outside the time. So it's moving towards spontaneity and somehow breaking what we can call the ghost of social sanction or social punishing, because we are this feeling that you're always being watched and that you're going to make a mistake, and then Rebecca telling us that there is no such thing as a mistake. But if we deconstruct this idea through improvisation or any other method, then we can state or stand in a different way. Like there's no mistakes, or if there is a mistake, you can repeat it and then it's no longer a mistake, it's a gesture. It's no mistake because it's an opportunity to add a modification of the path, a modification to this path where, I don't know, a rock on the path, instead of making us fall, will make us deviate into a different path. And I think that's part of what we are talking about this morning. I will now give the floor to Ricardo Arias. He's an artist, a professor very well appreciated, who is here present in Mexico City, but he's from Bogotá. His work is wonderful. I hope you can have the opportunity to know him. He has worked in different territories such as experimental music, but he's also a professor and a researcher. He had very interesting approaches, not just about improvisation, but also on other areas regarding listening. So I will give the floor to Ricardo to make a closure to this panel. Yeah, the social sanction. Yeah, no, the social pressure. He's going to be the one finishing. But, well, after he finishes, we are going to have some minutes so that you can make comments or questions. Ricardo. Okay, thanks for the invitation. I will start talking about the topic, but I want to say some things that have to do. Well, first of all, I was called for this panel some days ago, so I don't have a text per se. When I heard the word presentation, I was like, what, to present some words into a space? Yeah, it's a methodology. I can write down some words on the paper, which is a methodology that I sometimes use in the classroom. I place some things up on the table or upon the paper, and from there I start to create something. Now, I have this little cap here on the table. It's it's a cap that I use every time I'm about to improvise because it gives me powers that allow me to improvise in an acceptable way. So this first page of this notebook is what I started to write down when I wrote or when I was trying to improvise something. Of course, the title is to collaborate because that's the title of what I was supposed to be talking about in this panel. So I started to iterate. It's really hard for me to bring together a speech that's coherent. So it's something like, for me, giving a speech is formulating groups of words that go hopping around different topics. So collaboration, I started thinking in terms of other words. Collaborate or to collaborate is like, okay, working together, but I don't think working together is not the only way of characterizing this activity of improvisation. I don't think this is at work. So it's not the only way or the most eloquent word to express what I want to. So I started to use other words that are here, like a constellation of associations that I was navigating. Maybe I should erase some of these words in order to not repeat myself. I started thinking about coexistence. You share with other people, you share a space, you share a time with others, and you are co-inhabiting. So a good presentation should have, or it could be helpful to have some diagrams to give some order, to make it look more scientific. So I started making a diagram or drawing a diagram to try to create a scheme of my thoughts. And well, here's a circle that it's like an individual. I know that the circle has another implication, but here is the circle, which is the musician. Here we have the space, which is an internal space, but also an external space. The instrument, which is our bridge, our intermediary, and the rest of the people, other people who are around. So the circle, I divided it in four. I made some lines in order to interconnect. And then by watching this morning and thinking about a person we have mentioned a lot, which is Pauline Oliveros, I thought about the mandala of Pauline, which is a circle with a point in the middle, well, with a spot in the middle that represents different stages of consciousness or attention, focused attention, global attention, but it could also be related to levels of collaboration, levels of presence when it comes to improvisation. Like maybe you're somehow absent, you're present but you're absent. That's something that happens. You're there but you're not there at the same time. And then it moves towards the peripheral part of the circle until having a presence that's a present presence, so to speak. So I was building some ideas. Something else that came to my mind. This trend of thinking that improvisation is idealized, instead of seeing it as, I mean, that other perspective is valid, but I think there are other ways of understanding it. We can think of improvisation as something virtuous or morally high, but I think that collaboration, co-inhabiting, this co-creation is just a condition, an initial condition that can lead us to either something beautiful, something amazing, or the other way around. Because collaborate could be thinking in terms of interference, like I'm interfering here. And interference in terms of sound, like right now, I can build with interference, but I can also annihilate, or I could silence with interference. It could be productive or non-productive. So I just wanted to show this possibility that it's not neither good nor bad to collaborate. I mean, collaboration per se is not neither good nor bad. We tend to idealize it because we want to have a good result. But if we are honest, we know that most of the times the result is not necessarily positive. Sometimes collaboration results in something negative. So in my mind, I start to find a connection of the diagrams and the words. Interference can be constructive or it can be destructive. Destructive interference, well, in acoustics, sometimes we tend to lower the volume when we found this interference, or we try to cancel that interference that could lead us to silence, even though it's a result of a destructive interference. It can be constructive. So polarities are always present. Other words that came to my mind, because all of this is within the framework. Of course, presentation needs to have some quotes of important people, and bibliography and all. So one quote that came to my mind throughout this beautiful panel is the quote of Cornelius Cardio, an English composer who spoke about composition or improvisation as a composition of reality. And the reality is the things that happen on a daily basis, being with friends and just living. In that context is where I take the coexistence, co-inhabiting, and collaboration. That's my first quote. Second quote that is connected to this is a phrase, a very witty phrase, because Chris Mann was quite witted, an Australian poet, also a composer, who defined listening as the aesthetics of not knowing. when you are listening, you know nothing. You don't know what happened. You don't know what's coming. So it implies or it demands a certain disposition to whatever is coming. Of course, I was taking notes in my notebook because I was picking ideas from the colleagues. Ideas that were giving a beautiful shape to my circle. We have, of course, fragility, vulnerability, becoming vulnerable or embracing vulnerability. Also, reciprocity. The act of coexistence also has the act of co-inhabiting. Also, I say offering and receiving, which goes hand in hand, because improvising is sharing space, sharing a time, and it's offering something. You arrive into a household and you are offered a coffee. You are improvising and you're offering sounds, you're offering silence, and the rest of the people either take it, they can take it, or if they don't want to take it, they don't. But it's a complex network of reciprocity, of taking and giving, which also brings along trust. Or not necessarily. You could be standing in a different space or in a different footing. Another word that I wrote down, and because I was trying to find words to pre-existing words that could help me express this word about failure. I said co-failure, fail together, like trying and not being able to have success, or having better failures, as John Beckett said. So negativity becomes something positive that at the same time goes back to being negative. So it's like a loop. But the co-failing, co-create, co-something, all this prefix. Also the word in English co-mingle, being together, to blend together, coming together, as we say in Colombia. Blending, getting together, which is a word that they use in Colombia, which is juntanza, or the situation where you are together. I wanted to share some sounds through my iPhone. But of course, I couldn't prepare it previously, so I cannot find the sounds that I wanted to share. But it's the negotiation. Of course, as I told you before, I'm just trying to make a connection, like the fly who is revolving around some words that I wrote down. I, of course, not intending to build a structured argument whatsoever. Because it's a complex situation. I think bringing it down into an argument that will end up into a conclusion would just ignore the complexity. Human relationships, and one of its manifestations is improvisation. They are, and I'm not going to quote per se, I'm going to paraphrase here to North American composers that have a vision, not necessarily related to improv, but to composition, who are David Dunn and David Rosenbaum, who speak about music as an ecology of shared meanings within a context. That is, we agree, most of those who are here, that what we are doing is what we think we are doing, but also what others think we are doing. So there's layers of complexity. There is a consensus that brought us together today, and that creates an ecology of sense, like a geography of meaning. So the fact of being here is already a collaboration, is already a coexistence, and implies all the previous words: reliability, trust, and their contraries. And that is what creates certain results. We are usually like good people, no? Results are usually good. Sometimes we disagree, but we do not express it not violently, or maybe we tell some lies, but we do not fight. You know, we're not gonna punch the other person just because we disagree. And I think that's something I wanted to put over the table. Being able to think about collaboration in more complex concepts. When we talk about collaboration, the types of differentiation means that we have to deal with not being or not agreeing, because that brings about contradiction. And being able to deal with contradiction is fundamental. Otherwise, it becomes a club of people who think alike. And we don't want that, because that's like seeing a single color, even if we are too many. That's not going to take us anywhere. So to wrap up, because when we are bored, we don't say we get bored, but sometimes we get bored. I mean, let's be honest. So I don't want you to get bored, and if you get bored, please tell me. I wanted to close with another version of the conceptualization that we've been trying to do. It's not convenient to make this a moral element, to make of improvisation a moral statement, and not just improvisation, like co-inhabiting, being together with the same aim. It's like a concomitant situation. Being aware of when we are trying to moralize, to being right, to be superior somehow, morally superior. When referring to this type of relationships, it's hard to find a middle point or a middle ground, a space of silence. And well, that's it on my behalf.
Muchas gracias, Ricardo.
Thank you, Ricardo. So let's open a window to think together. Well, the window, the door. I think you shared something interesting, because at the end of the day, we are in the realm of critical studies. And although we have made a lot of celebration to improvisation, we need to think about another fundamental element, which is reaching this point zero or ground zero, where improvisation can occur in its core personality, if we can say that. Sometimes it's just a matter of concurrence. We can agree or disagree, and from there things can emerge. not with a precise aim. There won't be necessarily a teleology. I would give this last minutes to the audience so that they can participate. They stop being just listeners and they could share, I don't know, a message, question, comment, or whatever situation they would like to share. Wait. Very interesting, and I'm really happy to have had a time to be here and listening to all of you. I was curious, well, I am curious. I mean, leaving behind the theological issue that was just arised, which is not relevant at this point when it comes to speaking about a process. I think that in improvisation has to do with a process and not exactly with a result. But I would like to ask Ricardo about a possible explanation of what he understands as failure. I would like to propose that maybe failure could be what is a failure, what is not, or maybe you feel like a failure when you're not. How do you frame failure from the perspective of idealization of impro, as well as an umbrella term, but also from the perspective of that the purpose could be a social aspect rather than the speech. The idea of coming together for something, but coming together is the most important part, and not necessarily coming together for something. So, how do you understand failure in this realm? Now that you mentioned failure. I think it's present in just being happy with a result, saying, "Oh, that's great music," you know. It's what you said, focusing on getting together, focusing on the process, and not necessarily on the final product. That in this case would be something intangible because it's played and then it just goes with the wind, or maybe you can check the recording, but if you check a recording, it's a different instance. It's no longer the experience of being together. So in that regard, to a more or less extent, some of these improvisations fail. I would actually make a link of this notion of failure and success with memory. When you have memory, you can judge a situation and say, you know what, I fail, or you know what, I succeeded. But if you don't have memory, which is my case, no, just kidding. No, it's hard. If you don't have memory, you cannot have a judgment on the result. But in terms of co-inhabiting, I think it's easy. You know if things were okay or not. It's like inviting people over to your house. In the end, you are either happy or sad or whatever. No? So you know the result. But I think it's more a feeling rather than a result per se. I just want to say something interesting finally, and I forgot. I'm sorry. Okay, I remind you that we also have George and Cees, in case anyone would like to say something. Oh, the last thing. Non-failure, I experienced it in music a couple of times in 40 years. A couple of things, it has been completely clear that we transcended, but the memory of what happened is not there. but there is a feeling that's not individual, it's collective, and it's not expressed in words. It usually occurs in big silences, big common silences. That would be the non-failure. Thank you, Ricardo. Benjamin? Cees.
The interesting thing about mistakes and failures in jazz, Miles Davis always said, if there's no mistake, that's the real mistake. You got to make mistakes, and we make mistakes all the time. And that's the nice thing in improvising. And that's the terrible thing if you're trained as a classical musician and then you go into jazz, because the classical musician makes no mistakes. You're punished for making mistakes. That one note that was really the wrong one, you're eternally punished by the reviewers, by the journalists, by the critics, and so on and so forth. And in jazz, we say, it doesn't really matter, where you made that wrong note, you play one half higher or one half lower, and you still have the right note. There's a famous example of an improvisation that Red Garland does playing in the Miles Davis Quintet. And at the end of a solo, he really makes harmonically a very strange mistake, what you would not expect from Red Garland. And Miles Davis solves that problem by beginning his solo with precisely the same note. And that, I think, is the nice thing of collaboration in jazz music. That's what we teach in Amsterdam. I work with a lot of youth big bands. So we train the kids not to be afraid of making mistakes, because in jazz, you don't get punished for your mistake, as you get in science and classical music, but we take it as a learning opportunity. So I'm all in favor of making mistakes. They create learning opportunities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, this is a great way to think about the question. Jack Halberstam has a book called The Queer Art of Failure, and Julietta Singh has one called Unthinking Mastery. And part of the notion of mistakes and not mistakes comes from a Western understanding of, which is anti-improvisation. It's meeting expectations rather than frustrating them. And Miles is a terrific example of this. You hear all sorts of cracked notes and things that don't work, but it's the aspiration, it's the imagination, the willingness to do it that is important. Herbie Hancock once said that Miles told him, you play too many butter notes. And when you get trained as a musician, they don't tell you which notes are the butter notes. But what Miles meant was that you shouldn't play the easy expected chords. You shouldn't play the things that everybody else has continued to play. And, Rebecca called our attention to the fact that there are mistakes in the sense that there are injuries you can do to other people. There are ways you can fall short of your moral and aesthetic ambitions and obligations. So we're not saying that everything is right. Thelonious Monk listening to a radio station, and the disc jockey says, Mr. Monk is good, but he often plays the wrong notes on the piano. And Thelonious Monk called the guy up and said, well, there are no wrong notes on the piano. He didn't mean you couldn't play anything wrong or that anything was as good as anything else, but he meant you shouldn't in advance assume that replicating a certain pre-expected standard is the way to succeed. The other thing is thinking about Cees's discussion of parallel time. What fails at one time succeeds in the next. That when bebop comes along, people think they're failing to understand swing, and yet bebop was in some ways parallel time, thinking ahead, but also drawing back on things from the past. And so I understand why people get anxious about the idea of mistakes and failure, but that's often being judged by a standard that is not in our interest.
Muchas gracias. ¿Alguien más por acá? Benjamín, por favor.
Bueno, quería simplemente...
Thank you. Here, Benjamin. I just wanted to thank a lot the presenters, and also you, Tito, as a moderator. And I wanted to share an impression, a global impression. And it's the idea that even though we think that impro is within the social world or even within the political world, when we see it from the perspective of what you have exposed, and we focus on the notion of collaboration or relations or a bond, we could think that politics are also within improvisation, which I think it's strictly true because social world is improvisatory. Improvisation is there, and they produce and they sustain themselves in this unstable realm of improvisation. I think that we could reread political politics or social politics as descriptions of phenomenons that have a certain aesthetic dimension. Uh, there's a living thing about it. So I just wanted to share with you this perspective that derived or emerged after listening to all of you with great pleasure this morning. Thank you. Thanks, Benjamin. We give the floor to another participant. Thanks a lot to the presenters that were listening this morning. They take quite relevant elements that were stated in this colloquium since the beginning. I think that you somehow resolve certain doubts that I had regarding certain points. I would like to go back something mentioned by Cees Hamelink, that cooperation is essential for survival. This part of improvisation, and not just as a secondary matter, but as a fundamental part of impro. If we are not in group, if we are not collaborating as a group, maybe we would have not survived. It's a vital element to, there's not an election, there is a necessity of improvising, but also improvising as a group. We tend to think that we can live without the others, and that's absolutely not the case. And it's there since the very beginning of our lives. And also this listening capabilities that demand silence. And why is it so hard for us to produce silence or to find this place of silence, to get together or to have an encounter in a different position? That is improvising in the face of a society as an act of a defense, as an act of resistance. And I think when we talk about resistance, it makes a link with George Lipsitz, who talked to us about a parallel time and improvisation of a parallel time, and improvising a strategy of survival, and survival as a political act where we are not just seeing the history we are living, but also a political act that brings us back to the past as a historical memory, just as how the kids were educated, their families, their background, and how the background led them to act in a certain way. So this historical consciousness, it's necessary so that we can create something for the future, but also for the present. That is so relevant today, considering the lack of orientation that many young people have currently. Now they are moving towards fascism because fascism is so present in the media. Like what is happening now with the wars, that there's no awareness, or there's a lack of awareness because of the media, because there's a bombarding of information and social media. And so I believe that George brings back the importance of memory, of improvisation as resistance, as a form of being rebel in order to transform the society where we're living at. I don't want to use much more time, but I just wanted to bring back an element of Rebecca that speaks about embracing fragility. I work with youngsters in dynamics of improvisation, and all the dynamics that they develop as to not show their fragility. And all that I have to do so that they can open themselves and they can open themselves to their bodies, and so they can find this silence to hear their own emotions, to hear uh, their own feelings, because that's how they protect themselves from suffering. And giving them or providing them with a methodology so that they can hear themselves. I think psychoanalysis here provides us with some methodologies, with some tools to enter with in contact with ourselves. So fragility linked to fear and the difficulty that we have as humans to touch our fear, because you become fragile, because you brought down all your barriers. I think that would help us to understand many things about ourselves and transcend those shades of ourselves. And that could be dangerous for the future. We might repeat our mistakes or our pain. So I think that's what Rebecca has mentioning or was mentioned. That's what I understood Rebecca referred to when saying that there's no mistakes. Moving away from judgments, moving away from this is right, this is wrong, from moral judgments that are a sort of coercion upon our ways of being and doing. But I'm going to leave it here. Thanks. I just want to add something to the last about the last person who spoke about not romanticizing improvisation. We should work upon that, because improvisation is also the result of a lot of work and a lot of awareness and disposition and openness. And on that regard, the interference, constructive and destructive interference is something we should be thinking about too. And offering, how he divided as offering activities of reciprocity, and I say this using this as a ritual that also defines us as human beings. Thanks. Well, thanks a lot. We lost a little bit of time. We started a little late. It was a technical issue, but we have to continue with the next panel. I don't know if Cees or George would like to make a final remark for closure.
Because we don't have a lot of time.
A very short one, because we have little time. If not, well, we want to thank you. Thanks for your conversation. Thanks for sharing your thoughts with us. So we are going to close this panel. We're going back to silence. Thanks a lot, George and Cees, for your interventions. We deeply appreciate. Also, Ricardo and Rebecca, thanks a lot for being here, and see you on the next panel. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.